carcass, cut in half, stunner, slaughter line, spray wash. These words appear in his head and strike him, destroy him. But they're not just words. They're the blood, the dense smell, the automation, the absence of thought. They burst in on the night, catch him off guard. When he wakes, his body is covered in a film of sweat because he knows that what awaits is another day of slaughtering humans.
That's bad, but his job cannot compare to the horror of having to respond to like 3 emails every 2 or 3 hours,
Oh, I
frankly.
mean, after long enough, you're like, please just give me a fucking like punch gun and just like put me on the slaughter line. Seriously.
The average coal miner, the average slaughterhouse worker, the average logger, their average crab cannery ship worker cannot understand the pain of 5 unread emails in your inbox, two of which are flagged with the little red flag. You don't want that shit.
Dude, I
I say
mean,
that as a joke, but like, remember how many miners didn't want to learn to code? They were like, no, fuck that noise. I still want to.
legit,
But
like the Battle of Blair Mountain could have been averted entirely had it just it's a war that could have been an email, you know?
that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. In fact, one of my favorite facts about Blair Mountain is the U.S. Air Force at a certain point started dropping leaflets on the miners, telling them order from the President of the United States to cease and desist, because a lot of these people were like ultimately patriotic. And when they received that order verbally, they did stop. Because their war was with the companies, it wasn't with the United States government. Because, like,
Mhm.
that was their dynamic. These people couldn't read. It was literally the meme, this sign can't stop me because I can't read. They were getting these pamphlets, looking at them. The handful of people who could read were like, I'm not telling them what it says, because they were like the ones with mostly like the Marxist education and shit like that.
Right.
Like the people among them who were the readers were mostly like not intellectuals, it's probably not the right word, but like these people, a lot of them were even like from Eastern Europe and shit like that, like refugees from World War One. And a lot of them had read Marx and stuff, and they're like, I am not about to tell these people to stop. We're about to crush this like fucking mercenary army. So yeah, the sun can't stop me because I can't read. And all that to say, our boy Marcos, he could use a little bit of that energy instead of the whole slaughtering humans business. But we'll get into that on today's episode of the Socialist Shelf.
Socialist shelf. Read good books and organize yourself. Socialist shelf. Read good books and organize yourself.
You're now listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.
Welcome to the Socialist Shelf with me, Jacob, as always, here with Lenore. Lenore,
Hello.
how are you doing this fine evening, or whatever time it is for those listening?
I am waking up. I'm crushing my second Red Bull of the day, right on the heels of the three espressos with which I washed down the first one. It's been a long day. I didn't get a whole lot of sleep the other night because I got my COVID shot recently. It's the worst reaction I've ever had, like chills, sweats, like comparable to any flu that I've had. But hey, on the bright side, I'm protected through 2025, hopefully. And also I have 6G now.
You know, if you had just slowed that down, some periods in there, chills, washed it down with 3 espressos. She was on her second Red Bull of the day, protected from COVID through 2025. But hey, on the bright side, she had 6G. That would be prose from this novel.
Cranking out an episode right before her turn on the slaughter line.
Yeah, yeah. She wondered today, would she be the eater or the eat the eater or the eaten?
I mean, we're both eating right now. We're very handsome individuals.
I'm eating, I'm slaying, I'm serving, I'm busting it down. sexual style, etc.
Goaded
Um,
with all kinds of sauce.
all kinds of sauce, whatever they put on the humans, the special meat. We are talking about Tender is the Flesh, a pretty recent book. Is this the most recent book we've read? 2017?
I think
Augustina
so.
Bazterrica?
Yeah, I think this is, yeah, this would have come out the year after Hillbilly Elegy. So, to the extent that book had any claim to fame on our show, it's very quickly dethroned and, good
Good.
riddance to it.
When did Red Plenty come out? Maybe Red Plenty.
Um,
That's neither here nor there. That's
I have a
boring. But
spreadsheet somewhere.
now I asked 2012. So yeah. Most recent book, we're gonna say. Um, Tinder is the flesh. And as dystopian as the world in this text is, and we'll get into it, something far more dystopian haunts our own world, and that is the continued suspension of the at Socialist Shelf account on Twitter, or X, the everything website, as it is called.
Yeah, this
Um,
is getting Kafkaesque.
it's getting frustrating. It's almost as bad as eating human meat. Um, but unfortunately, we have no answers for this. But the reason I bring this up is if anyone has any like creative ideas for us getting that account back, I just have no desire to build up another account and like look for our followers and shit. I'm not doing that. I don't want to do that, but also like Twitter's the only website really for like a podcast account. So like if you want to like at Twitter support and be like, yo, restore the socialist shelf. It's at socialist shelf. They did nothing wrong, or whatever. If you got ideas, do it. I'm kind of joking, but on the other hand, like we have gotten followed by a number of people on there that we like respect and want to like work with, and now they see like my like little Twitter account that's just for me because I realized or was told I was going to get banned if I just made another socialist shelf account, which like I'm less worried about if there's no chance of getting the other one back, but I'm trying to. So yeah, no, kind of annoying. So if anyone has any ideas on that, if you want to fight back against the system, the powers that be, and you want to stop it from getting as bad as Tender as the Flesh, this is sort of the first node on the step to eating human meat. First they ban the socialist shelf. Next they start shipping you to the slaughterhouse. So if you end up getting eaten and you didn't tweet at Twitter support, I'm sorry, no sympathy.
But you aren't the least bit curious about how like your fellow man would taste.
I mean, like I've tasted several of my fellow.
This will be the Socialist Shelf after dark.
This is the only jokes we'll be able to make this whole episode because this book is fucked.
Hmm. This
Anyway,
this book first crossed my attention because like if you've been on like the book subreddits r/books, r/ like horror lit, r/extreme horror, like you'll have seen like the weekly or like bi-weekly thread about, oh, what's the most disturbing book you've ever read, and invariably this book makes the list. I was positing to Jacob earlier that it's very The Jungle-esque. It's very Upton Sinclair-esque in impact versus intent, I think, from what I've seen on online discourse on it. Because, certainly it has that element of, okay, this is disgusting, it's set in a dystopia where humans are bred and slaughtered for meat. But to engage with that is to miss a whole lot of stuff bubbling beneath the surface.
yeah, honestly, the way people engage with this book I've seen is just like, wow, that's fucked up, right? And like, of course, we can all say, yeah, of course, it would be fucked up if there was like mass industrial slaughterhouses of humans and people ate them and called them special meat and there was cognitive dissonance and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, that is the part of the draw of the book, right? It is a horror novel. It is, and it's a quite, it does its work well. There's no denying that there's just like a shock value that we're going for here. I mean, like I have a quote from an interview with the author where she said, after she became a vegetarian, she said, quote, "A veil was drawn and my view of meat consumption was completely changed. To me, a steak is now a piece of a corpse. One day I was walking by a butcher's shop and all I saw were bodies of animals hanging down. And I thought, Why can't those be human corpses? After all, we are animals, we are flesh, and that's how the idea for the novel emerged, end quote. And to be clear, it's not because the novel is like trying to get you to be a vegetarian or a vegan. It's just like she, with her sort of shifted mindset, which she went vegetarian for health reasons, actually,
Mhm.
was just like, oh, well, you could eat a human too, and there will probably be like good humans and bad humans and this, that, and the other taste wise. And like it was that, but like it has a lot the interesting things of this because there's like a million and one shitty horror things where it's like, and they ate him, huh? But like what makes this interesting is like it's about existing in class society. And not just a class of like the eaten and the not eaten, right? But it's about people at the various nodes of the society that is driving people to the slaughterhouse. It's that old sort of adage, no one who works at the bank likes what the bank does, but the bank continues to do it, kind of thing.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. The author of this book, of course, we mentioned Augustina Bazterrica. We can get into her a little bit because there's so much more interesting that she has to say about, I mean, it's in the headlines of her interviews, right? The Guardian, Augustina Bazterrica, capitalism and cannibalism are all the same. The Irish Times. I have always believed that in our capitalist consumerist society, we devour each other. Of course, there's more to it than simply capitalism driving humans to eat each other. There's also misogyny that she gets into, every kind of exploitation you can imagine, which she has a unique perspective on growing up in Argentina. And why don't we get into her a little bit?
Well, the thing is,
Um,
capitalism has done nothing but treat Argentina well and continues to this very day. I haven't read the news recently, but seems like capitalism is going great for the Argentinian people. I hear they've got a pretty based new president.
oh,
Uh,
on the subject of Reddit, it's the first Reddit president, famously.
Honestly, yeah, no, that's what I was gonna say. Like speaking of Reddit,
Actually, no. That honor would probably go to El Salvador, the Bitcoin dude.
the Bitcoin dude, yeah, yeah, no, what's the current guy? Javier Milei? Is that
Javier Milei, yeah.
Milei? Yeah, no, absolute wholesome Chungus 100 Reddit ass president for sure.
He looks like if like Beethoven lived in your upstairs bedroom.
If Beethoven was your like brother's stoner friend.
Yeah.
But then he was like, dude, anarcho-capitalism is actually kind of like this guy, what's the over under that he's used the term based during a cabinet meeting?
What's the Spanish for based? I don't know.
Comment. There's no comments on this. Send us an email. What is the Spanish for based? But speaking of based, we want to talk about what this book is based on, and that's through the author's experiences, which, okay, I don't know. Lenore, back to the back to the author.
Yes, the answer to the puzzle of based will be in our Spanish version, El Estante Socialisto.
That's what I'm
Uh,
saying.
Now, Agustina Basterica, born in Buenos Aires in 1974.
Hmm.
1974 is kind of a pivotal date in Argentinian history because that's the year that their president, Juan Perón, is ultimately overthrown by the military junta that took control of the country for a while. We're not going to get as deep into Argentinian history as we did with like Japanese history in our crab cannery ship episode. Because it's not as directly relevant to the subject matter as Japanese history was to that.
Well, yeah,
Uh,
frankly, like this book doesn't even necessarily take place in Argentina, right?
yeah,
It's an unspecified country.
unspecified. Yeah, yeah. It's you have the context clues, you have the author's origin, to assume that okay, this is some country in Latin America. But yeah, it's 1974. Perón's overthrown. There's the military junta. Operation Condor kicks off next year. Major period of repression against leftists all across Latin America. Like if you've seen from reactionaries like memes about like socialists getting thrown out of helicopters, that's where that's from.
Mhm.
But again, we don't really need to get into all that. Peronism is too big a subject to cover for this episode. Um, what's important is that Basterica went to the University of Buenos Aires for fine arts. What I could find of her in Spanish says that she started placing in literary contests not long after she graduated in Buenos Aires in 1998 in her mid-20s. She
Mhm.
started winning in '04. She's been a fixture in the literary scene of Buenos Aires and beyond basically to this day. Now, since 1999, when she starts in on this, is she's working as a secretary at this time. So she's
Mhm.
balancing that and her writing career for quite a while. She starts with poetry and short stories. In
Octavia
2013,
Butler type beat. That secretary writing short stories. This is feeling the shades of Butler here.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And she starts in 2013, she publishes her first novel now, Matar a la Niña, or Kill the Girl in English.
I hate
Uh,
when girls get killed.
oh,
It's always a
same,
tragedy.
same. Well, I mean, you're gonna hate this book then, but you know.
They don't twist it around. Yeah, what's Kill the Girl about?
I didn't look that up.
Oh, my bad. My bad.
Presumably a girl dies.
I think she's fine.
I was more interested in her most recent book, which we'll get to. In 2016, she publishes a collection of short stories Antes del Encuentro Feroz, before the ferocious encounter.
Hmm.
Again, one assumes there is a ferocious encounter in that book,
Hmm.
unless our expectations are subverted.
Well, the flesh is tender in this book, so she didn't subvert those expectations, though other expectations were subverted, but we'll get into that.
Well, we'll get into the title of this book too in Spanish. In
Yes.
2017, she writes Cadáver Exquisito. Literally, it translates to exquisite corpse. We'll get into the why of that because there's a blink and you'll miss it of that title in
Yeah.
the text of this book.
I've got a hot take about that. It's not that hot. I
Yes.
think that's a better title than Tender is the Flesh. But
We can warm it up a bit.
yeah.
The English title is, of course, Tender as the Flesh. It makes a huge splash. She wins the Premio Clarín de Novela for that year, which is a major Latin American literary prize. It goes global. It's translated to this day into over 20 languages. In 2021, the year after the English version comes out, is when she's able to quit her day job and live solely on her writing.
Hmm.
And since then, she's come out with another short story collection, 19 Claws and a Dark Bird, after she said, she wants what she writes about to sort of get his hooks into you like claws, that sort of thing. Several of those stories themselves have won awards when they appeared independently before. 2023, last year, she put out The Unworthy, which is about a convent surviving amidst climate catastrophe, and there's a false deity or whatever. It sounds really neat. She's I couldn't help but think of Paolo Bacigalupi in that
Mm.
space, right? The sort of post-climate catastrophe space and rebuilding a new religion, new authority, new ways of basically adapting to a world order that you have to make seem natural in order to survive within it without going insane, Which is
Hmm.
what I think this book is about, right? It's about coming to terms with your position in an exploitative system, when you're
Well, the
confronted with
interesting
case.
thing is the dog does die in both of them.
That's true. That's true. Several in this one.
Yeah, we could call Does the Dogs Die this episode.
Yes, and I think this is as good a time as any to mention the sort of stuff that you'll hear in this episode if you listen through to the end. There is, of
Happy things
course,
only.
yes, happy subjects such as animal violence, such as sexual violence, of course, murder, dismemberment of human beings. There will be, of course, familial death and the family drama surrounding that.
And
So
annoying sisters.
Oh, yes. Most traumatic of all, annoying sisters,
Honestly, in the context, pretty traumatic.
If my
And
sister is listening, hello. I love
hey,
you.
look, did if so long as your sister has not done the death by a thousand cuts torture to a random person she bought, then she is a step ahead of this guy's
I
sister.
don't know what she and my brother-in-law get up to, like that's their business.
Well, as long as they got their umbrellas.
So yes, in Basterica's daily life, she's an art curator. She teaches writing workshops. She's on Twitter. She seems very pleasant. She likes the Borgias, Toni Morrison, horror films. I follow her. Y'all should too. August Basterica on Twitter. Um,
She
she
should tweet for the socialist shelf to get it. No, I'm sorry. I'm in a mood today. I don't know.
What I found really relatable in a Spanish language interview that I didn't translate this, Firefox did for me. The other day at a reading club, we talked about the film Ghostbusters, the first scene. They're going to look for the first ghost in a huge public library, and there's a ghost lady reading. I want to be that ghost lady, she says. When I die, I want to go back and read.
Oh,
And there's Jacob, you mentioned her interview in the Irish Times. Why can't those be human corpses? After all, we are animals, we are flesh. That's how she gets the idea for the novel, right? So she does a deep dive into the meat industry, into the factory farming, all the processes they're in. There is criticism of that in here. I think people from the meat packing industry have reached out to her and said, yeah, this is accurate. But, more broadly, she's indicting all the corners of society where we cannibalize, where we exploit each other, and come up with language to mask this because it benefits us. Sex work, human trafficking, poverty, patriarchy. And that's ultimately what this book is more about than just the violence itself, is the
Hmm.
language that we come up with to compartmentalize these things. There's a great panel actually that she's on in a literature festival in The Hague a couple of years ago. I used to live there in The Hague, where she talks about all this. And indeed, she says to The Guardian, tender as the flesh is a meditation on what capitalism is. It teaches us to naturalize cruelty, she
Hmm.
says. That the challenges of being a woman drawn from her own experience, being catcalled in high school, being sexually harassed on a train, living in Argentina in particular, where a woman is killed every 18 hours. That's what goes into this book,
Not to
and it is
mention
dripping off the
illegal abortion.
page.
I believe she makes the point, abortion is not legal in Argentina, and there is no official record of how many women die because of that.
Hmm.
Or, obviously have their lives negatively impacted as a result. Just another thing. Not to be that guy, but interesting that the anti-government libertarians running Argentina see fit to have big government in that one area. Crazy how that works, huh?
Yeah, I'm sure there's no contradiction there. I'm sure it's I don't know, maybe it gets lost in translation. I'm sure it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, no doubt that Middle A has got it all figured out. As I recall, he has a cosplay that's armor once was in a cosplay with armor with the colors of the ANCAP flag on it. So pretty cool.
God.
The last sight of mini Akami before they're destroyed by facts and logic.
For the world's first cryptid president.
What was it Elon Musk said? Get ready for Argentina's GDP to skyrocket on.
I mean, listen, like Britain calculates like, the black market in its GDP, like there's speculation there's like, rent speculation in the United States, like which is included in GDP, like what you would charge yourself if you were a tenant in your own home. Like so much of this shit is fictitious and it's all gonna pop.
No doubt. Well, very very interesting, woman. She seems lovely. Obviously there's like that language barrier for us with some of the like media and this, that, and the other, so like less exposure, but really happy that this book has been translated, and that we have some interviews with her and we can get these different stuff. I guess it's worth acknowledging at the top that we don't really know precisely how this reads in its original language. I mean, I've looked into it and seen this is a supposedly faithful adaptation of the style, the cadence, this, that, and the other. But ultimately, like any translated work, this is a translated work. And I guess that's
Hmm.
something that like we have to acknowledge at the top. So one of those things where I always feel like strange commenting on the actual prose of something when the author did not write the original prose. I always wonder, like, how close is it? And I don't know. Once again, Spanish speaking listeners, send us read both copies. Take your time to do that, and then send us an email. But do we already read the first paragraph? Lenore did at the top.
Well, and I'd like to read the second because it
Yeah.
really it hits the ground running on that issue of coming up with language to, not only sell a model of exploitation to us, a model of literal cannibalism to us in this setting's case, right? Um, but to police that language and to make it and to make the whole thing tick, right? Uh his body's sweating. He knows that what awaits is another day of slaughtering humans. Yeah, here we go. No one calls them that, he thinks, as he lights a cigarette. He doesn't call them that when he has to explain the meat cycle to a new employee. They could arrest him for it, even send him to the municipal slaughterhouse and process him. Assassinate him would be the correct term, but it can't be used. While he removes his soaked shirt, he tries to clear the persistent idea that this is what they are humans bred as animals for consumption. He goes to the refrigerator and pours himself cold water. He drinks it slowly. His brain warns him that there are words that cover up the world. There are words that are convenient, hygienic, legal. And on one level, I mean, within the first two paragraphs, you get a sense of how vigilantly this division between humans and human cattle, right, between the humans and special meat is policed, right? Even the verbal distinction is enforced on pain of becoming that which is repressed and consumed, right? And, this is, in one sense, because the near universal taboo of cannibalism, it's just so viscerally opposed to, pretty much every standard of morality that we're aware of, that it needs that sort of constant vigilance to undo. But you have existing parallels in human history. I've been reading a lot about the Civil War lately, and I've been thinking right now of how lynchings were big community events in
Yeah.
the post-Reconstruction South, right? And not just community events, family events, right? If you're a racist white Southerner, you take your kids to see these things happen, to see these people repressed, brutally executed, and, to teach them from a very early age how certain people are dealt with, right?
Right.
And,
It's a ritual.
right. And so it is here. You see how these relations are taught, reproduced, constant brutality and the threat of being rolled up in it.
Right. And she's of course making a clever choice here, which is the idea of what is something she can pick that, your normal reader is going to be horrified by, right? Because unfortunately, there's so many things she can pick from the real world, right? Not that cannibalism has never happened before, but there's things she could pick from the real world, like, bombing innocents, starving innocents, et cetera,
Hmm.
homelessness, all manner of that you could say, well, that's something that exists somewhere, right? Whereas she had to find something, like I said, cannibalism has existed, but on this mass industrial scale, right? Industrial scale cannibalism as something that will horrify all readers, but something that can be directly, if you think about it, compared to another thing in the real world, the scale of death, the way people die. Of course, the violence here is more direct. The violence is more, um, you know, she makes the point of like femicide and people dying because of poverty, right? And when we think about people dying because of poverty, it's not necessarily, though unfortunately in some places it is, you get lined up and you're shot in the head, right? But it is systemic and there are nodes in the system that make it continue to happen. And notably, as this book notes, most people that are nodes in that system are not doing the actual shooting in the head. There's a handful of people that are specifically trained and have the specific skills and the specific mindset, no matter what that might be able to be the ones who swing the hammer or pull the gun or whatever, shoot the bomb, whatever you want to call it. But most people just have to like, clean up the guts or fill out the paperwork or, cross the T's, dot the I's. And that's like one
Hmm.
point she wants to make. I also want to make the point that she grounds this in literature from the beginning. She opens with a quote from Leopoldo Lugones that says, "And its expression was so human that it filled me with horror," which is from his short story. It's Yzur. I'm not quite sure how you say that, but it's about a monkey that basically of sort of evolves and takes on like a human character, right? It's about this guy who owns this beast, and this beast takes on human traits. So in this way, it's sort of a reverse, right? The human is reduced to livestock, and when you look at the human's face, them having that human expression is horrifying to you because you're trying to ignore that. Whereas it's sort of an inversion. So she's kind of right from the beginning, referencing it's a literary reference that you can like look into, but it's also just a great quote. But he and himself, interesting author and heavily grounded in Spanish modern poetry and Spanish sci-fi fantasy. Interesting guy.
Hmm.
Might have to give him a crack at some point ourselves. But yeah,
Add him to the list.
that's the setup right there. And our main character, did we say his name? Because the book doesn't for a while.
Yeah, well, you get his first name and then you get his last name dripped to you a little later. Marcos Tejo is his
Marcos
name.
Teo. So the narrative always just calls him, he, whatever. Like it never, it's just like he walked to the thing, he, whatever. It never says Marcos. It's only others who refer to him by his name.
Hmm. So yeah, you got Marcus Tejo. He is or was propertied. He inherited a meat processing plant from his father and then sold it, right? And now he's the right-hand man of the boss, so he still works there. So he
Mhm.
it's mentioned that a pig he was slaughtering bit him, and that's the point where the team saw him as more than just the boss's son, right? So he comes from that background, but at the end of the day, what he wants is an honest day's work.
Wants an honest day's work, and he wants to, take care of the people in his life he's needs to take care of. What you're introduced to from the beginning with Marcos is a guy who just like, he's relatable, I'd say. Like if you've worked a job that you just don't want to, but you're like, I got to get it done. You know what I mean? He's got a
Hmm.
dad who is in the nursing home, who is dealing with, mental disorders or at least one, if not more. Um, he's got a sort of estranged spouse, his wife, after to the death of their newborn child, moved in with her mother. They're not necessarily mad at each other. She just needed to leave the house. They haven't seen each other, and we're not quite sure how long, but it's been a minute, clearly. And we don't really see her till the end of the book. He's just kind of got to like make his life work in this world that is post-apocalyptic, sort of. There's no one apocalypse. It's a series of apocalypses, little ones. Like I said, shades of Parable of the Sower here, very much
Hmm.
so. This really could be Latin America in the world of Parable of the Sower simultaneously. Um, and basically the government has made the call. Yeah, no, we're gonna have human meat. There was a disease that ravaged all animals except some of them, unclear.
Allegedly.
Allegedly, right? It never says specifically, but Marcos has his doubts. Marcos believes it was to deal with overpopulation. Now we don't know what the population got to in this unspecified year, but clearly it got to a point where at least the government thought things were unsustainable. And they thought, well, if we start eating people, that'll clean things right up.
Hmm.
Um, and to a degree, it has caused a degree of societal stabilization. And we don't know exactly how long human meat has been made legal, but we're talking at least 20 years because there's a woman who was born in captivity that it identifies as being 20 years old in this book. So human meat's been illegal for a minimum of 20 years, but clearly not as long as Marcus's lifetime because he remembers the pre-human slaughterhouses.
That's correct, and he muses on it throughout the book, but in particular in chapter one to sort of lay the groundwork for this setting, right? Because he calls it the transition,
Mhm.
right? And there's a
Capital
bit.
T.
Yes, the capital T transition. And he thinks to himself that, yeah, like that word itself is also part of this language of like, the manufacture of consent for this, right? The sort of flattening of the actual enormity of this event, right? Because it doesn't capture the suddenness of it. It doesn't capture the brutality inherent in it, how this particular paradigm shift affected each country, how the ruling class of each country indeed use it to deal with their problems. He mentions that, that by this time, immigrants, marginalized people, the poor have already been slaughtered in some countries prior to the breeding project, the breeding for human meat.
Yeah, it
So,
says at one point, quote, groups of people had started killing others and eating them in secret. The press documented a case of two unemployed Bolivians who had been attacked, dismembered, and barbecued by a group of neighbors. When he read the news, he shuddered. It was the first public scandal of its kind and instilled the idea in society that in the end, meat is meat. It doesn't matter where it's from, end quote.
and you sort of wonder about that, how such a thing would have been reported on and discussed going forward, because a few paragraphs later, there were massive protests, hunger strikes, complaints filed by human rights organizations, and at the same time, articles, research, and news stories that had an impact on public opinion. Professors and researchers at prestigious universities claimed that animal protein was necessary to live. Doctors confirmed that plant protein didn't contain all the essential amino acids. Experts assured that methane emissions from cattle had been reduced, but malnutrition was on the rise. Magazines published articles on the dark side of vegetables. The centers of protest began to disperse, and the media went on reporting cases of people they said had died of the animal virus. again, like this process of consent manufacture by newspapers of record, by trusted institutions of media, of medicine, of governments, you get the sense that, I mean, this book came out before COVID started, obviously, but I couldn't help but think about that the whole time I was reading it. Like and the news story is about how, well, we need to get people back out into the economy, this, that, the other, about how, like, every time you see a headline about like vaccine hesitancy and the dangers of vaccines, right, these things have an impact on how people see a global pandemic or a catastrophe in general.
I have bad news for you about that. There
Sure.
is a corner of anti-vax Reddit that has adopted this book and champions it
Oh
as sort
God, are
of
you
a
kidding me?
symbol of resistance, of this is what they want to do to us if you take the COVID vaccine or you wore the mask or you don't want to die of COVID-19.
I'm
Um,
I'm not going to pretend that, like, there isn't a state aspect to, like, the origins of anti-vax sentiment. Of course, the Pentagon just recently admitted that, yeah, we spread all this shit in, like, the Philippines. Who knows how much of it has blown back here, but there's also just some, like, weird fucking people who espouse this stuff.
Yep. Yep, absolutely.
Hmm.
That's how it goes. It's an interesting mix. I wish I could blame it all on malicious government forces. Unfortunately, there are also people who are, we'll say their job in this world. What would their job be? I don't know. Not
Well, they
not
would
one
be
of
the
the.
they would be the scavengers.
I do think so. Though the scavengers actually show a little bit of creativity, so we'll
They
see.
do.
So maybe these people will get creative. I hope not. But all that to say, this society, one more point I'll make is this society talks about the governments, it talks about big business, it talks about them making alliances. One thing you'll see, and I think it's very intentional, is one, no reference to the specific government in question in this book. We can assume it's Argentina or some Latin American country, or perhaps some Latin American super state that's formed in the future. We don't know. We know that this is a thing that's being sort of globalized. We know during the course of this book, India legalizes the selling of human meat. So there is some, and we know there was something with China. There's like different stuff. It doesn't really refer to nearby countries, but interestingly enough, this big business, and this government seem to sort of be one. There doesn't really seem to be a lot of distinction, right? Because you have government agents who are doing inspections, but
Mhm.
they're as much on the behalf of the business as they are, against it. They are um
Well, and Marcos himself was on the team that helped sort of shape these regulations.
right. And it was a revolving door between that and like the business. And when it's referring to individual businesses and distributors, it's not really referring to like this corporation or that corporation so much as it is to just like this plant or that. Like they all seem to be nodes of one like integrated public-private partnership, that is just sort of uh hell-bent on eating as many humans as possible. And I think, if you were really, if you're a real world building head, this book might frustrate you to a certain extent. There are certainly things where it's like, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, or that's not that efficient, or this, that, and the other. But when you realize, what she's going for here, right? And the vibe. And this is also, to be clear, all in like really Marcos's head. So this is what it feels like to be Marcos, right?
Yes.
That it all kind of makes a little more sense. This is a very fixed perspective here.
Matt Stober,
Um,
this is how it feels to be Marcos Tejo.
that would I don't want to feel like Marcos Tejo. Um, though it really, really wants you to feel sympathetic for him because dude just has a bad time most days.
It is interesting to get the perspective of somebody who was, who does come from the bourgeois side of this, who did until recently, own the property that was carrying these things out, who himself is indeed content to work within this paradigm, right? You know,
I mean, do
um,
more than work within it. He's high up in it. He helped make the policy.
Oh yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
no, absolutely. But that's the thing. Like, to get a perspective from somebody who is aware of this sort of thing and who spends his days just trying to deaden his trying to deaden his relationship to it, trying to detach himself from it as much as possible. No one can call them humans because that would mean giving them an identity. They call them product or meat or food, except for him. He would prefer not to have to call them by any name.
Yep. It talks about like when he goes to a butcher's shop, can we call her friend? Whatever she is to him, Spanel? Is it Spanel? Spanel?
Spanel, yeah, maybe.
Spanel? It says she copied the traditional cuts of beef so the change wouldn't be so abrupt. A customer would walk in. It was like being in a butcher shop in times past. The shop transformed gradually but persistently. First, it was the packaged hands that Spinell placed off to the side when they were hidden. It goes on. It talks about the kidneys, the special meat, the upper extremity, the lower extremity, the this, that, and the other, the eyeball liqueur. Getting real freaky there. It talks about this slow, though not that slow, adaptation and being like, okay, well, we can actually kind of synthesize this. The point was made to me the other day by a friend who just sort of said, like, offhandedly, like, or one of us did. I don't remember how it started, but just like, we really just as a society, really as the United States, just took 1 million deaths to the jaw, just like that in 2020 and 2021. And we really just kind of like, absorbed it, And so that's another example of like, this book feels very like prophetic in certain ways. Like it feels very COVID core. I don't know. It is interesting that it's a little older than COVID.
There's
But
a there's a
it feels
guy
very connected.
There's a guy who I couldn't get out of my head who was on Biden's COVID transition team for the first year at least.
Transition with a capital T.
Yeah, there were.
Transition.
I mean, in the sense that Biden's CDC was working overtime to not only get the pandemic under some semblance of control, but also to normalize its continued presence in our society because the goal was never to eradicate it. Um, you familiar with Zeke Emanuel?
Yeah, of course. Rahm Emanuel's brother.
Oh yeah, of course. No. He was the bioethics chief. Oh, he is the bioethics chief at the National Institutes of Health Clinical Center. He was on Biden's transition team. He also wrote an article called Why I Hope to Die at 75,
Mm-hmm.
where he lays out his philosophy that like, look, I would never impose this on anybody. I would never mandate this, but
Mm-hmm.
I want to die at 75 because I don't want to be, a burden to my family and to the states and this, that, or the other. Like why the obsession with extending our life. And it's like, who knows what role he played in shaping policy, but that's the sort of, thinking that goes on within the halls of power when we're dealing with, global pandemics, global crises, it's this, there are people way up at the top in our ruling class who are like, look, what if people just agreed to lay down and die?
To be clear, I was not joking. He is Rahm Emanuel's brother.
Oh, really? I missed that.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Rahm Emanuel, the all kinds of stuff. Currently ambassador to Japan, and also brother of Ari Emanuel, CEO of Endeavor, the entertainment agency that owns the UFC, WWE, the William Morris Agency, and more. These people fucking are related. It's crazy. It's crazy how it works. But yeah, absolutely. It's this exact same eugenics policy. And actually, you couldn't have chosen a better figure for it because he's like literally by blood connected to this like political slash corporate media and government and health establishment. This just blob of horrors, and these people are literally brothers. Like, the fucking Three Stooges walking around to kill us on three fronts, really.
It's real interesting to me how these things how these things are pitched to us,
Mm-hmm.
and like it just it's one of the things that I found most depressing in recent years. Well, and also like if you're on the inside of this stuff, right? I think that's one thing Bazterrica does really well is it's got to be it's got to weigh on your soul if indeed a soul you have
Right.
to make yourself okay with this, or just to put yourself at a far enough remove that making yourself okay with it is not something you need to think about, right? I mean, Alikar Katsanis is really good in his writing about mass incarceration about this. He refers a lot to human caging because that's what it is,
Right.
because when you're talking about border militarization or mass incarceration or sanctions, or getting people reopening the economy during a pandemic,
Or special meat. It's all the
yeah,
same shit,
there's a very deliberate effort in our political and media spheres, right, to obscure the human factor in these problems, right, to abstract them as mere matters of infrastructure and exchange.
Mhm.
I poked my nose into Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. He talks about, like, in flattening everything into an exchange value, right? Capitalism subsumes all critique into like marketable aesthetic,
Mhm.
and that's basically it's this book takes that to like the next logical step, right? And makes human flesh, your fellow man, like itself, a you know it fuses the threat of becoming part of a super exploited underclass with literally being cannibalized. You are yourself a product.
Right. And at any point in this world, it seems like almost every crime is punishable by just getting turned into bacon.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Um,
and like, and Marcos is tormented about it, certainly, but like that's what I like about what this book captures. This aura of capitalist realism, right? Powerlessness to even critique this thing, right? There's nobody to blame. There's no contact with the author of your suffering, and the whole structure more broadly is acknowledged to be capable of these great things, of affecting this transition, but not considered a subject that can exercise responsibility. There's nowhere you can really attack it from. It just has its own inertia, and you can only be swept up in it.
and because of that fact, Marcos does pick targets, but not in the correct way, right? He picks out characters who are
Mhm.
important nodes in the machine, right? The first one we meet is Signor Arami. He does the skins, right? He does leather, human leather. He has El Gringo, who just like runs the actual like the breeding process, and El Gringo will later actually give him the female that will be important to this. He's got multiple. There's the guy later on, Erlet, who's like a Romanian
I
hunter
love
killer.
Erlet. He's my
Um,
favorite character.
and we'll get into him in a little bit because it's a little further on. But yeah, like Erlet, like I forget the name of the doctor, Dr. Volka, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Oh
and
God.
interestingly enough, Marcos really fixates on these figures who are running these different establishments as sort of the people to blame, right?
Hmm.
Not even so much like he's got a very friendly, like slap on the back relationship with like the guy who actually uses the hammer on the people. He's very like, oh, that guy, he's great at his job. Fucking love that guy.
You can have a beer
Uh,
with him. Yeah.
right, exactly. And even his own boss, he's got like oh no, well, that guy's chill. He's just doing his job, right? So
Hmm.
he's more annoyed actually by the annoying idiosyncrasies of these characters. And it's blink and you'll miss it, whether he's criticizing them or the system, right? Because he'll be like, oh, it's so gross what she does here. And I hate how she taps her cane so loud, right?
Hmm.
Like, and if you're just kind of skimming it, you're like, yeah, he hates being here. And it's like, does he just not like these people? And like he's just like personally disgusted by seeing like, in El Gringo's laboratory, like the fucking pregnant women without arms and legs and the like
Hmm.
this, that, and the other. Like, is he just put off by it being gross? Because for the most part, that is like Marcos is abstractly disgusted by all of this. But as you go through it, if you pay really close attention, he's actually a lot less horrified than you might just assume by just like putting your own horror onto Marcos. And his actual individual pains are usually directly related to experiences he's had rather than this like broader society, which, the quote unquote twist at the end is actually perfectly foreshadowed
Oh
by
yeah.
this guy that Marcos actually is. Um,
Oh yeah, I mean, because the brutality of it all goes much further beyond these individual people that annoy him, right? You get a sense that, okay, like if one were removed, somebody else would just as easily step in and take their place, because it extends down to the rank and file as well. There's a wonderful, I say wonderful. There's a wonderful bit on page 25 here, right, when he's in the breeding facility that El Gringo runs, right? And there are workers there who are roasting a rack of meat from a child, from what would be considered veal in this setting. They're celebrating that one of the farmhands just had a kid by roasting and eating a human child.
right. And I mean, like, the author Christina, she makes the note that like in her own culture, that like she's she says this during her passage in the interview with the Irish Times, where she's like, I'm not being a militant vegan here or something, right? This isn't to convert people, but like,
Yeah,
in
no,
our
she.
society, there's an almost religious fixation put on the barbecue, right? It's like a
Mhm.
thing that brings people together. It is at the end of the day, the consuming of flesh, obviously not the consuming of human flesh in her whatever, but like this idea of like there is the ability to have a strong cognitive dissonance in humans, and it only takes so much to make that jump.
Well, and that's the
When
thing,
you
right? It's
dehumanize a human, of course.
and it's a cognitive dissonance that comes much easier to somebody, I think. I was kind of rambling about it earlier before I drove home. But that cognitive dissonance, even if you do occupy this space in the hierarchy, can hit you if this particular paradigm, if this particular, set of production relations, like if it doesn't give you everything you need, right? If it doesn't fulfill something in your soul, and that, of course, that disconnect really, really crystallizes for Marcos in the death of his young child, you know
Yes.
and so he spends the whole book trying to resolve that, well, like this particular human relationship, this particular thing that was irreplaceable in my life, is irreplaceable by this paradigm that I find myself in, because everything that I see reminds me of this, in a world where flesh is no longer sacred. There was this hunk of flesh that was sacred and had a name, and that I can't ever get back.
Yep. And he spends, a lot of time reflecting on this. There's a place he returns to several times. It's an abandoned zoo where his father used to take him. And, he just kind of walks around there, and people are afraid there might be animals there. Turns out there are some dogs, and he names them Jagger, Watts, Richards, and Wood, names after the Rolling
That's cute.
Stones. Has a little moment with them. He's not really afraid of the virus. You see like kind of synthesizing in his head, like, no, I don't really believe in this shit.
Hmm.
You basically just have like these little moments. You have different ways he's kind of processing, just like existing. There's a weird character that exists only in part one. Spinell. I mentioned her. She's a butcher, one of the first butchers who was like, fuck it, I'll cut up human meat. I don't give a shit. I'll sell it.
Hmm.
Right. She was like, and she worked for his father before, and it's implied, not implied, she definitely had sex with him when he was younger. It's implied that I don't know how old he was and how old she was when the sex happened. It said he was not yet a man. Unclear
Hmm.
how old she was. There may have been like the dynamic there seems a little like messy, whatever. And then, later on he shows up and has sex with her in a very violent, semi non-consensual way that she then gets into. It's a very weird.
On a cutting
uh,
table, yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's very like in a movie it would be very aesthetic and the blood and the what it's a scene, it's what it is, but there's like another, it's just like another way he's like processing this is he's just got this relationship with her that then just falls apart once he gets somebody else to go after.
Well, and the fact of, Spinell occupying the position that she does, right? The only people who can afford to reopen and do business in the sort of butcher shop like industry, like with the human slaughterhouses, only people who can afford to do that do so, right? It's expensive business because of regulations, because even though it's a regulated market, it is still a new market. So there's a big black market and just murdering people and selling their meat. Um, the new
And it's
shops are,
implied there's like a purge time after dark where like nobody
yeah,
cares if you do that, though it doesn't get into
exactly.
details about it.
Right. And this is a woman, by the way, who, like, when she's having sex with Marcos in the slaughterhouse when he's much younger, right? She steadies herself on meat hooks to do this, right? She
Right.
grabs onto them while she's getting into position, on a cutting table that happened to have been clean and sterilized. And like Bazterrica mentions that this person who was an early adopter, who is now thriving under the risk system, was particularly well adapted to it, right? She's indifferent to the world. She's slicing meat with the coolness of a surgeon. She says, she's used to the tasks of butchery, whether it's animals or humans. She's much more focused on the act than the reason. And it's with that same detachment that she's, able to, have this encounter with young Marcos, because she wouldn't expect a carcass to try and pleasure her, right? She actually stops him when he goes to touch her.
One thing I find odd is that, and I don't know that this is, I mean, it's like borderline of criticism. Where the hell does she go? Right? Like, I feel like I don't think her name is mentioned in Act Two at all, like, or part two of the book at all. And it's very strange. It just seems like a strange thing to just sort of drop. Because I was actually interested in that. So it's kind of a character that was like sort of frustrating to me because I felt like it needed one more interaction. There was one more moment. It was like, I don't know, you have like their meeting and then their second, and then I don't know, that seemed like it was going somewhere. But at the same time, um, she does make the line early in the book that she was like, who knows, maybe I'll be cutting you up one day, right? And I
I
thought
love that.
and I
Yes.
thought for sure, oh yeah, 100%, like he's gonna go to the slaughterhouse at the end of this book. I thought
Mm.
that probably for the first like 90% of this book that he was gonna end this being eaten. Which is I'm glad that she doesn't because that does seem so obvious, right? That seems like the obvious horror ending. So
Well,
maybe it's also part of that. She gives the line that's supposed to be the like hint hint to the future, and both she and that is dropped because it's just not that kind of book. But at the same
yeah,
time,
exactly. At
kind
a
of wanted to see
different
more of her.
Yeah, in a different sort of book, perhaps it would have ended that way. But I mean, you do get the sense that, I mean, that conversation that you mentioned, Jacob, is, something that Basterica acknowledges that, yeah, it could get her and Marcos in trouble. Like but it's their participation in what they acknowledge is a sin that kind of draws them together, right? Like, that their casual conversation about using each other's meat on the black market could be problematic, but he
Right.
needs someone to say what no one does, says the pros, right? Like it's this thing of, as I was thinking earlier, right, when we were talking about, one, sussing out your relationship to this paradigm, right? Is he truly in finding individual like things, behaviors about the people he associates with annoying, more annoying than the brutality they're taking part in, right? You know, has he come to terms with it? Or is it a constant trauma response of like fixating on little things, to try and, attack your mind to something that's, not horrific, right?
Right.
It's be so the fact that, they can just come out and talk about this thing that's around them that everybody's just kind of supposed to accept. It's a catharsis in some way, A,
Sure.
but it's also one that makes it more easy to immerse yourself in it, B. And, developing these coping mechanisms damages you in ways that leak into every other interaction with human beings ultimately, like it says here, there's something about her he'd like to break.
Mm.
Mm.
Notably, though, she's the first person he has sex with that day.
Uh-huh.
We'll get into it in a second, but basically, he's been given a gift. He has been given by El Gringo. He's been given a purebred, born in captivity human. It's a beautiful girl. Is implied she's 20 years old, and it's obviously horrible. She's raised in captivity. She doesn't have vocal cords. She's got the mind of a very primitive animal. He ties her up
Mm.
in the barn. He doesn't want her. He's annoyed with it. Um, and it's worth noting in this world that because of the meat relationship, you're not supposed to keep these people, but you're supposed to acknowledge them as things, as slaves, and you're not supposed to treat them as sex objects,
Oh,
especially.
they say straight up in chapter 7, slavery is barbaric, with a
Right. And the reason is because they don't want this intersection to exist, this strict caste
yes,
that they've
yes.
created. If
Hmm.
you start crossing back and forth between it, you get into really, really dangerous territory. They are creating a very strict hierarchy. Um, by when he first got like a naked 20-year-old woman he acknowledges attractive, I was like, okay, fuck, I feel like I know where this is going, right? This is guy's got no wife at home. This is not good. Um, and I want to note before we talk about her, she is a first generation born in this new world, right? There's
First
another
generation pure.
Right. There's another first generation pure though. Uh, and it is the people born on the other side. And you see that when he visits his sister, right? He visits his sister and meets her little freak kids, these little twins who are just like, tweens or little teenage, like 13-year-olds. And they're just like, we play a game that people play online where we're like, what would this person taste like? And they
A
like
game
whisper
called Cadaver Exquisito.
exactly like right, the exquisite corpse. And they're like always whispering to each other and talking like the twins from The Shining and shit like that. Like this is the other first generation. They were born into the world where this was normalized. There is no memory of the past for them. This is just normal for them now. And this is these are scary little kids who then like, yeah, drop the name of the book, which I do think Exquisite Corpse is probably a stronger name.
It is the better title because it directly refers to, you have this society now where everybody's for sale, everybody's for consumption. You're taught this from childhood, right? It's, that the game is the title of the book, right? It's about the alienation that it takes for such a society to function and the language with which that is constructed.
Also, the name of a Watsky song, Exquisite Corpse. It's the
Really?
bonus track on the album Times Infinity. And they wrote it by having each person write one verse, and the only thing they could do is read the verse of the rapper before them. So the song gets increasingly strange and goes on odd arcs in various directions. It's like an 11-minute song. It has like Davi Diggs in it, like randomly.
Really?
Yeah, zombie apocalypse, robot clowns, all manner of various things.
I'm gonna go
But
listen
neither
to that
here nor
after
there.
this
It's
episode.
called Exquisite Corpse. I don't really even remember that well what it sounds like. I just remember the song. Um, I know Rotsky at one point goes, red, red wine, I don't want to die. I don't remember why though. All that to say is he has, and I don't find that the kids and his sister to be particularly compelling. They're just examples of suburbia in this society. And, it's mostly normal suburban life. Plus they eat, human arms and
And
shit.
people who have adapted to it in a way that, Marcos himself cannot, and from whom he is just, irreparably alienated. It's actually kind of kind of entertaining how he stands up to his, I don't want to say stands up to his sister toward the end because she's not particularly like oppressive of him or anything, but just she's vapid in a way that he cannot stand.
Right. She doesn't take care of their ailing father. And like he's got that, frustration with her. And I think there's a frustration that unclear exactly what her and her husband do, but they're clearly not working directly on the front lines of exploitation. They're
Hmm.
not the ones who actually have to bring the hammer down. They
Right.
are still beneficiaries of the society. It's very likely they work at companies that are doing like logistics and shit for transporting meat, but it doesn't matter because there are a few levels removed. I've heard it said, and it doesn't apply as much in our modern society, but like in at least previous societies, especially like feudalism, the more liberal aristocratic types were the ones who were more removed from the direct exploitation, and the more conservative types were the ones who were doing the active exploitation, but both were reaping the rewards from it in their own ways. And
Oh yeah.
it makes me think like that.
Yeah, well, and you get indeed, like, you talk about being removed from this stuff. Like you get some of the saddest shit in here when he goes to see his dad at the nursing home, right?
Hmm.
His dad, of course, is suffering from dementia in this setting. It's not really clear how long it's been going on. What really led to the onset of it. There's
Well,
this
he does say he thinks the transition broke him, though.
yeah,
And the
it's a
transition is a minimum of 20 years ago. So his dad has been ailing for a hot minute.
Yeah, it's a romantic notion, not in the sense of like love, but in the sense that yeah, this experience has had a physical impact on you. The emotional is crossed over to the physiological.
Right.
And indeed, there's as you find out, there's no more funerals, right, for your for your family members because bodies will be disinterred and eaten by scavengers, right? Nursing homes will be authorized to sell dead people for relatives to pay off debts, right? Some still remain as she's talking about cemeteries here. Some still remain as relics of a time when the dead could rest in peace. So ceremony has suffered, right? There are fewer celebrations, there's fewer remembrances because, something unspoken has transformed everybody into a potential product, into a potential purveyor of product, right? It's this more commonly accepted savagery reintroduced into civilization that's effectively problematized the very concept of an interpersonal relationship, of saying goodbye to somebody because nobody is just a somebody any longer.
Hmm.
And yet this distinction remains between somebody who's effectively degenerated beyond independent existence, the father. Between that and livestock, there is still this distinction.
Exactly. And the distinction begins to be crossed when he gives the woman that he has been given a name and he impregnates her. He calls her Jasmine because she smells like jasmine. And he has a scene where he's washing her off. And it doesn't get into detail. It just says, What he wants to do is prohibited, but he does it anyway.
I love that line. I really
Yeah,
do.
it's very well done. And
Mhm.
it's one of those things where it's obviously, and this is becomes increasingly clear, this incredibly clear by the end, but Marcos is like a guy that every single step of it, most scenes, you're like, yeah, I feel for this guy. I feel him in this moment. Wow, that sucks.
Well,
Wow,
because again,
whatever.
like I mean, you understand why he is where he is because, like,
Mhm.
he has this attachment from the death of his son. He has this attachment from his father because the grieving process, like the impending grieving process itself, has been crippled and truncated by the demands of, the new capitalism, right?
Right. That said,
It's why he and his wife had this rift between them, right? Because they
mhm.
can't process this loss, they can't move beyond it.
That said, this book is very good at doing that. And it almost makes you gloss over like the objectively horrifying shit he does in this book.
Oh yeah.
Until you can't anymore by the end, which we'll get to. But like, obviously, this is not a woman who can consent in
No,
any way.
she's
Um,
effectively it's
she's
the
got the
th
mind of a child, or not
yes.
even, she's been intentionally stunted. She's not aware of what he's even doing to her. Um, this is and it's one of a number of horrifying things he does. And then that's the end of the first part of the book.
Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
the thing, right? It's why it's the genius of this world that Bazterrica has built, right? Because like by the standards of this world, because later on there's an anecdote about a woman who catches her husband, doing the same thing, right? Having sex with this first generation pure like head, as they're called,
Yeah.
that he's bought, right? And she's horrified because, oh, he's having sex with this animal and I just want it out of the house. Like, and it's that thing of where, okay, so by the standards of this world, that is bestiality. But it's an atrocity. But the fact that it's been constructed, to be viewed in that way is itself, because of the atrocity of reshaping this world in that way.
It's worth noting, and I feel like this is a moment where I can make that point, though I'll say it again, that when interviewed about this book, Augustina, she mentions Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, I believe is what it's called. And it's a book that argues that Eichmann and men like him, Nazi Germany, did what they did out of complacency in the system, that these people are not psychopaths or sociopaths, the majority of the Nazis, and others who do similar stuff, that these people are not just like, it's not like Nazi Germany was a society where tens of millions of people suddenly became the fucking Joker, right? Like these people woke up every day, they made decisions, and each of them had a reason why what they're doing was, if not okay, then justified in their specific case, all the way up to fucking Eichmann and Goebbels and these people who were like, well, no, I mean, obviously just following orders is the classic quote, but like these people just had a banal view of like, this is my job and this is what I get
Hmm.
done. And I got people I got to take care of. And, I have my critiques of Hannah Arendt and some of her other writing, but she makes some great points in her talking about the banality of evil. And in the same way, Marcos, he is, it's understandable why he's miserable. Uh, I'm sounding a lot like the JD Vance episode. Uh, make of that what you will. It's understandable why he's miserable. It's
Well, yes.
understandable why he has resentment. It makes perfect sense that he is frustrated and feels trapped. And yet he still does what he does. And that does not make him not evil. If you crack open the brains of everyone, basically, we'd consider evil, with a very, very small percentage of someone with incurable psychological or borderline incurable psychological, trauma. Most of them throughout of history are just people who like have a reason for what they're doing. That's probably a pretty boring reason. There's not a lot of supervillains out there. There's
Well,
just not.
yeah. Yeah, and for Marcos, you have this pre-existing, notion of yes, all humans are human, right? You have this knowledge of this time before some of them were livestock, right? I mean, chapter 18 toward the end of part 1, right? He mentions the odd female that stands out among the many that move through the place every day, right? Talking about the head moving through the slaughterhouse. He still looks at some of these, quote unquote cattle as humans, as women in particular. He can't
Which
quite
doesn't make
shake
him
this.
better because he's not doing shit for him.
Exactly. He can't quite shake the sense that this person, if not a person, is the same species, which is
Yes.
still grotesque. It's the part of it where it's this chapter, where he looks at Jasmine that way, where he thinks of, her in that way, where we get a sense of how he thinks of, the head every day, right? And then he goes and he has that, sort of a non-con to con encounter with Spinel, right? It's this part of the book where I'm like, okay, I have a sense now of where this is going, right? It's
Right.
this thing of where he's flirting with a taboo, right? Attraction to this woman that he owns, what would be considered bestiality in this world. And then he goes and he quenches it in another taboo that's more familiar, like assaulting this person that's he's familiar with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because now that he's acknowledged that, yeah, there's one aspect of himself that is incompatible within the bounds of propriety in this society, he finds it in him to indulge another aspect of himself that is incompatible with the bounds of propriety, and to claim something he thinks is his right, right? It's the
Mm-hmm.
sort of transactional approach to morality that only a setting in which everyone is commodified can engender.
And here's the fascinating trick that at this point where you're like, you should be at your peak, okay, I've turned on Marcos. She pulls this brilliant trick in part 2. It's a two-pronged trick. First of all, Jasmine is pregnant, about to have a baby, and he's treating her really well. It's creepy. It's parental in a weird fucking way, but it is kind of like, okay, I'm sad. Oh, poor Marcos again. And the other prong of it, and I didn't even realize it until we started talking about it, is she introduces not one, not two, but 3 sets of fucking supervillains into part 2 to make it be like, oh no, but this world does have super villain-esque characters, right? This world does have these beings that are beyond whatever. And then you forget about the evil of Marcos because you have the Church of Immolation. You have Urlet.
Yes.
You have Dr. Volka, right? All of a sudden we're in comic book territory and Marcos is no longer at the top of our mind as the horrifying guy. He's normal guy again. And it's actually a really brilliant trick.
There is the work of adapting this to this book is being adapted to the screen. I don't recall if it's for the film or for a TV show, but I really want to know more about the Church of the Immolation. Like it's a wild sort of thing. What it is this group of people, basically they refer to Jesus, so we assume it's some branch of Christianity where there's a whole religion around becoming meat, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
like the highest form of sacrifice and the highest aspiration that you can have is to become food for another human being. And even they are picky about it, right? Because the plants doesn't tell them, Marcus's place of work doesn't tell them that they just throw the sacrificial meat to the scavengers, who are people too poor to afford meat, right? So even in a
Which the
religion.
church wouldn't be okay with that if they
Exactly. Even in
Yes.
this religion of extreme self-terminating altruism, there is this sense that one life is worth less than another, right? You don't want to sacrifice yourself to the wrong sort of people, which,
Let me read a quote here.
yes.
And so, they've got this group shows up in their robes, and one man has a red robe. It's an older man, and says, he looks them over and sees everything is in order. The spiritual master tells him that the church member who will be immolated has been examined by a doctor and has prepared his testament and performed his departure ritual. The man gives him another piece of paper that has been stamped and certified by a notary and says, I, Gaston Schaff, authorize my body to be used as food for other people, and contains a signature and ID number. Gaston Schaff steps forward in his red tunic. He's a 70-year-old man. Gaston Schaff smiles and recites the Church of Immolation's creed passionately and with conviction. The human being is the cause of all evil in this world. We are our own virus. All of the church members raise their hands and shout, virus. Gaston Schaff continues, we are the worst kind of vermin, destroying our planet, starving our fellow man. He's interrupted again. Fellow man, shout the church members. My life will truly take on meaning once my body feeds another human being, one who truly needs it. Why waste my protein value in a meaningless cremation? I've lived my life. That's good enough for me. In unison, all the church members shout, save the planet, immolate yourself. Right? And it's obviously in the sort of context of this book, humans destroying the planet and this, that, and the other, obviously the sort of perverse, dark logic of this sort of weird doomer cult emerges. But of course, you see these people are not working to actively fix the world. They are doing a ritual of like self-aggrandizement and like
Yes.
personal enrichment up to the point of, obviously the individual is a victim clearly because like, yeah, why is the like spiritual master not the one? Like, why does he come every time with somebody, including like young
Yeah,
people and
even
stuff like
even the
that?
Aztecs, sacrifice their nobles.
Exactly right. But in this case, it's kind of like it's a matter of like, they've ritualized the horror. And like even the people at the meat factory, like these people are fucking weird, bro. But it's like, no, not necessarily weirder. They're just taking the logic and applying a religious veneer to it. But we are doing some world building here. We are throwing in some weird stuff here. We're throwing in some
Hmm.
characters for Marcos to sort of collide with and for his story to it's interesting because he interacts with three sort of sets, these supervillains sort types in a row in a way where it is almost obscures his plot, but it's by throwing him back into this world in the midst of his seemingly banal troubles of, dealing with the grief over his father and raising a child and stuff. It's suddenly he feels human again with these more than human weird creatures he's having to interact with, like this
Well,
church and
and
these
as
other.
well, like we skipped this part, but like there's a bit where he's walking two prospective workers through his plant, right, and
Mhm.
showing them like the process. And one of them's like horrified and like visibly nauseated, and but he asks like all the very smart questions about the process and keeps it under his hat. And there's this other guy who's just like obviously enjoying it and getting off on it, and Marcos just doesn't disguise his disdain for it at all. Both because the dude's a fucking creep, and because like if Marcos knows it, if somebody who professionally like deadens himself to this still notices it, one can only imagine what the rank and file would start thinking about were they to see this weirdo, and
Mhm.
get a sense of, okay, well, this whole thing is weird. But it's a wonderful sequence, but there's also again, my favorite character, Erlet, right? Can we talk about
Yes,
Erlet?
let's talk about Erlet.
He's this game reserve owner that Marcos does business with. It's mentioned very, very
And
early in the.
yes, it's the game you think it is.
Yes, yes, he sends particularly healthy head to him. It's mentioned earlier in the book. And this is my favorite chapter because it's very, very funny, right? You get a glimpse of the fundamental meanness and moral laziness that kind of proliferates here in this world. Like, let me just read some extracts, describing him. Uh Erlat is drinking wine from a glass that looks like an antique chalice. It's a transparent red made of etched crystal and has strange figures on it. Uh, Skip a bit. Erlat picks up the glass by its stem and raises it very slowly, as though it were an object of extraordinary value. The cup is the same color as the band he wears around his ring finger. He looks at Erlet's nails, he always does, and can't help but feel disgust. The man's nails are neat, but long. There's something hypnotic and primitive about them. There's something of a wail, an ancient presence to them. Something about Erlet's nails creates a need to feel the touch of his fingers. Uh,
Hot.
skip yeah, yeah. Oh, you're legit, like just salivating over here. Skip a bit here. There's an interesting bit about like how Erlet has like human heads displayed behind him. Antique photographs of black people being hunted in Africa before the transition, it says. So, you get a sense of the pre-existing brutality back from a time when there was, human zoos and, hunting for uh hunting for people in the time of, King Leopold's ghost talks about, all right. um it's this sort of person that's risen to the top in this new paradigm. He finds it difficult to determine Erlet's age. The man is one of those people who seem to have been part of the world since the beginning, but who have a certain vitality and as a result appear young. 40, 50, Erlet could be 70. Impossible to know. Again, it's this sense of, okay, there is this brutality, it's racism, it's bigotry, it's capitalism, it's commodification of this entire other class of people that's come to the fore here. There is also just the humor of this guy being like Romanian and seriously fucking vampire coded.
Mhm.
Like,
He literally says at one point, Let us take pleasure in atrocity.
Yes. Oh, I love that line.
Yeah,
He
yeah, exactly.
he's literally got like let's see. He's literally got
What
like
is a
books of
man? A dirty pile of secrets. He
uh
doesn't say that, but he should.
mankind ill needs a savior such as yourself. He's got literally like books of black magic, like the Book of Saint Cyprian, Enchiridion of Pope Leo, the Grand Grimoire, the Book of the Dead. He has the fucking Necronomicon, which I find funny because it doesn't exist. H.P. Lovecraft made it up.
That's not true because Erlet has it. So that disproves your theory there.
There we go.
Actually, Erlet has it. No, Erlet wrote it. He made it. He made it real. He brought
Oh
it into
shit.
being.
I hadn't thought about that.
He's cool like that. So yeah, and yeah, like on this game plant, like they've got like famous rock stars and shit like that who are like deep in debt or like, hey, I'll pay off your debt for if you're on the game for 3 days. And like the dude gets shot and they eat his dick. Like it's it's like the people who come here versus and once again super villain-esque, they're reveling in it, right? These are not the people who come here like Erlet and the hunters. They're not the people who are needing to call it special meat, call it pork, call it beef, call it something else. These are the people who are like, you know, excited to do the horror.
Yeah.
These are the it takes a certain amount of money, so you've got to be a certain level of upper class to be here.
It's the
There's
people on the fucking Epstein Island, you know?
exactly. You've gotten so high up in the society that like all that's left is just do an inversion of morality to just like worship like I'm not saying like billionaires all worship evil intentionally, but I'm saying there is a type of person and a type of exploitative position where all you can do is just to start to just like kind of inverse what is right and what is wrong. Yeah, Epstein-esque, fucking Salo-esque, like that type of stuff, like just that level of moral degeneration. That like that's what you're gonna do. And I hate that like it's not just vampire-esque because like it references a real event of humans hunting down people that very much happened in the Congo. And
Yes.
this guy has pictures from that, right? And he's being a cartoonish depiction of that because he is trying to become a cartoon, right? He is trying to become a image of what that villain should be. But ultimately, these are just people, and they're just people making people decisions. And he only has this power not because of the Necronomicon, because it's not that kind of book, because he's a rich guy, right?
Mhm.
And that's at the end of the day what's so fundamentally infuriating about it. And that's super villain number 2. And we won't meet number 3 until after Marcos goes through a bit of personal tragedy.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, there's the dinner that we have where the fucking the rock stars cut up. Where you get the thing that's sort of been brewing in the dark recesses of your mind that you don't really want to believe is true, but is directly stated. Where there are brothels in this world,
Right.
where you
I forgot
can
about that.
yeah
Yeah.
where you can you can have sex with a prostitute and then pay to kill and eat her. The sex trade is, I was thinking as I read this, the sex trade is obviously now tied up in the literal flesh trade. And this is something that Bazterrica literally says on page 148. It's again, I agree with critics that say she's a bit too illustrative at times because it's an easy enough conclusion for the reader to come to on their own, but it's a minor nitpick, because it's the sort of hideousness that this book would not be complete without, because because it's a place that people go to, IRL, obviously without the fucking cannibalism angle, but nonetheless, people will sink to any depth you can imagine, you know and there's this aspect of exploitation that like is performative, right? Because this comes up in discussion around the table. People will just bandy this information about freely, and you do it because you need to show you can afford to in such a setting.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a forget who it was who made the point that like by engaging in those rituals, there's also just this level of like everyone in the upper class has blackmail on each other because they've all seen
Yes.
each other partake, and like you have done this inversion of what is right and wrong.
Mhm.
And obviously that's not like super materialist. That's that's talking not about what makes someone upper class, right? You don't have to engage in these excesses to be upper class, but the psychology of one who exists in the upper class, right? It's a bit of a
Mhm.
tangent, but I had a conversation with someone not too long ago that like, and I get how people come to these conclusions, but they're like, we're not in capitalism anymore. We're in techno feudalism, right? Which is not true. But like, and I asked them to explain, and they went on saying, well, look at these like billionaires and they act like lords. They act like aristocracy, the way. And my counter to that was, we don't exist in techno feudalism, but our ruling class is so degenerate. Our capitalist ruling class, because it's still 100% capitalist, is so degenerated that yes, some of them do have adopted this aristocratic mindset. They do
Mhm.
have a feudalistic mindset. That is not the same thing as the social relations, right? Because um, none of these people at this table have power because of their birth necessarily. They have power because of money. They have power because of their relationship to capital and the government. And yeah, it's a worthwhile point. But regardless, it then takes us from this scene of just like, yeah, horror in an almost like, obviously it's got the horror of like the sex trade, which is horrifying, but then this almost campiness of the Necronomicon and this vampire ass dude. And then it takes us to sorry, Marcos, your dad's dead. Um
Mm.
and yeah.
Sigh.
Um and yeah, obviously dude was spent many years in a nursing home, not even like knowing himself. It's not shocking that he's dead, but Marcos has a lot of what he's done. He's justified by like, oh, I'm keeping my father alive, and it's like, well, how long were you going to keep your father alive, and then what were you going to do? You know?
Yeah, and you really get you really get some hilarious pettiness from Marcos because again, as I said, Marcos doesn't hide his disdain for his sister, like he
Yeah,
he calls he calls her in his head a monument to stupidity, like and
brutal.
he stops by when he picks up his father's ashes after the cremation, right? He stops by the zoo where they went to, right, when he was a kid and he shared this moment with his father where they watched the birds and he scatters his father's ashes in the atrium where the birds were and then he fills the crematory urn with like sand and he's like yeah this is what my sister is going to inherit just a box of dirty sand and that's all that she gave so
Yeah, he
that's all she
says, quote,
gets.
this is what his sister's going to get, an urn full of dirty sand from an abandoned zoo with no name. He even stubs a cigarette out in it.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing, because yes, it is petty, yes, it is, permanently in a way closing this person off from this closure, but again, it's closure that this person wasn't, had already kind of renounced, because it's a zoo with no name, it doesn't, it has a resonance for him, between him and his father that it doesn't have for her, that she consciously, seems to have forgotten.
While this is this, and it's interesting how this brings it down, right? It brings it down from this fantasy world, this dystopia, to this, level of human drama. And there's the human drama going on with him and Jasmine, right? Because now, and obviously it's a different mindset, but he's like taught her to watch TV and he's taught her to feed herself and he has a locker room, he has a camera to watch her, right? And it's obviously sick and weird, but like it in these moments where he's just like chilling with Jasmine and she's like giggling because she's silently giggling because she sees him come home and stuff, or like he like helping her shower and stuff. And he has the scenes where he's sad about his dad dying, so he's smoking a cigarette or drinking some whiskey, and he like yells at his boss on the phone, right? Or you know, arguing with his sister about like who loved his dad more. You suddenly you lose that it's back to the like level of like domesticity and the level of the
Mhm.
human damage and back to notably the sort of grand trick of us being like, oh man, Marcos, poor Marcos, just guys going through it, and all he wants to do is raise his child with this. And then you think about it and it's like, oh well, holy fuck, right?
Mhm.
And once again you come back to this character who is making these decisions, and with full context. And yeah, there's the whole part where he goes to see his sister and she's like, I'm so sad about it and this, that, and the other, and she's edited him out of pictures, um with her father and like edited her children into like being with their grandfather, even though they never met to his knowledge, and just all manner of things like that. Like back to this suburbia where this hyper exploitation
She's
of the
doing this
countryside doesn't exist.
she's doing this while, she has the audacity earlier in the book to ask him for like the family rate on first generation pure head, you know?
That's right. That's right. But yeah, if anything sums up like this funeral bit, it says, talking about his sister, she's erased him from the photo and inserted herself into it. People approach her and offer her their condolences. She takes out a handkerchief and raises it to her tearless eyes. And to me, this is another example of just the kind of interpersonal drama that's going on in this world because, life continues, right? And
It
people
finds a
are
way, you might say.
or quite the opposite, perhaps. In this case, life has gotten, a touch, even for the well-off, colder and harsher and more cynical. And yes, it does turn out that she in fact keeps a head, quote unquote, in her like fridge that like is like being kept alive and slowly tortured to death as it's eaten, which like maybe is an example of like a moment that she hits this thing a little too hard. But I don't really quite know what the point of that was, but I guess it's just the idea of this is a continued pervasive thing that's like rotting the edges of all stuff, and it's a status symbol, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but I actually was kind of disappointed that she had a head in the house. Right. I really like the idea of this suburbia where it's completely invisible to them, the
Hmm.
actual thing. And it's not my world, right? So like whatever. But like in my head, I'm imagining, you know, think about like obviously modern slaughterhouses are not killing humans, right? But like modern slaughterhouses in the suburbs, in the whatever, 99% of people, or more than, or a little less than that, don't have to think about where they get their hamburgers from. They just have their hamburgers delivered to them cleanly, right? I
Yeah.
I find the horror of this to function a lot better when in the cities, in the suburbs, in the quote unquote clean parts of society, it is all completely clean and you don't see that horror and they don't
There
get exposed to it.
Yeah, there is this sort of relish with which people take to this new reality that
Yes.
strains credulity at times. Like I'm thinking also of the at one point he finds a bunch of teenagers
Yeah.
who have just like broken into the zoo and like they're beating the
The
dogs to
puppies, the Rolling
death.
Stones. RIP
Yeah.
the Rolling Stones.
Well, one of them did die like since one of their namesakes did die since this book was published.
Mm.
Um, I don't remember which one, but yeah. So you have these teenagers in here just like beating the dogs to death for fun. I mean, again, this is a setting where the first time that Marcos goes to the zoo. I don't remember where exactly he sees it. Maybe it's a like derelict TV in the zoo, or like something that's on at Spinell's place, right? There's an old rerun of a game show where you beat cats to death with sticks, like for the promise of winning a car, right?
Right.
So you have these blood sports that are reintroduced into society, and again, as you say, like um, there's no real reason other than like human meanness to have these things be the case, right? And the teenagers say it themselves, like one of them gets bit by a dog and his friends are like, "Oh man, like you got the virus now, you're gonna die." And the kid's like, "The virus is just a lie. Like it's something that the government uses to control us." So like, there is a sense, we don't know how widespread it is in the public, but there is a sense that the virus is just a measure that the state has used to control the population, and
But
they don't care, and they're
why do you
participating with
think
it anyway.
why do you think these young teenagers are so like set though, like on just enjoying this violence? Because like personally, I think like in their lives, it's probably because they can't get no satisfaction, right? Like I do think the alternative title of this book probably was Jumpin' Jack Flesh.
I
Um,
mean, we have to have some sympathy for the devil here. Let's be honest.
right, yeah, Marcos, yeah, yeah. Well, what do we got? What do we got? What do we got? They had already slaughtered all the beasts of burdens. Um, Angie. I was just naming Rolling Stone songs. But yeah, exactly right. There is, I think that's the parts of this where it just doesn't quite click for me. It's not, it's fine. A book doesn't have to be perfect. It's a book.
Mhm.
Um, but I think when you're like,
If it doesn't start me up sometimes, that's okay.
there you go. I just think that she paints it a little too black. You know what I mean? Uh, she's
Not all the flowers that we see are dead flowers.
JD Vance. Um, uh, uh, that to say, I think that,
Yes, yes. Give me shelter from these puns.
God damn it. Um, I think that the places where this gets strained is by that fact, by the like, I think the parts of this book where it works the best is where it's like most people call it special meat. They don't want to think about it. And there's the nodes that they found that for whatever reason do what they do, whether they be uniquely freakish individuals, like Erlet, or whether they be just people who can like reduce it to a science, like the character we'll meet in a second, or whatnot, or whether they be like Marcos, who's just got the list of reasons why he's got to get through the day and drink his root tea and then go to bed.
Hmm.
um Whatever it may be. I think it works better there. That said, this isn't a direct allegory, right? And they're also walking the line between building a world and making a point. So it's not so much a criticism of a book as like, to make its themes click, I think it would work slightly better. Like, I like the idea better if like in the suburbs the kids maybe were like that way, like, why can't we get one for ourselves? But she's still like, don't talk about that, that's disgusting. I think
Hmm.
that, that's how I would have written it. But also, like, there are plenty of suburbanites who will like talk like wanting to engage in the most horrifying excesses of imperial capitalism, right?
Oh yeah, no,
Like,
I've had perfectly normal looking people say straight to my face, yeah, I'm fine with an ethno state actually.
right. Like, yeah, it is probably the people in suburbs who are the most talking about like nuking Gaza or something like that. So on the other hand, you know, I get where she's coming from. Just thoughts about the exploitation and all that.
Oh yeah,
Let's talk about the third supervillain.
Dr. Volka.
Dr. Volka. Ho, 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 ho. What
This
do you have to say
this
about Dr. Volka?
I mean, this person in a way is like it's the most frustrating in a sense because it's the let's first of all get into like who and what she is, right? Before the transition, like they or like early on, like they called her Dr. Mengele,
Mhm.
because her whole thing is that she buys head from the slaughterhouse to specifically like experiment on, in the most horrible of ways. She is indeed Dr. Mengele. She is every scientist at Unit 731, like
Mhm.
she is, the most hideous the most hideous things that you could do medically, physically to another human being, she does to these head.
She
Um
made COVID-19.
Very, very possibly, very
Mhm.
possibly. And it's the most frustrating part in the book for me because like it's the sort of person who revels in many ways some of the most horrifying shit and yet still finds a way to be put upon. I'm thinking of the bit where like she talks about let me see if I can find precisely the quote here. She talks about how hard it is to be a woman in her industry, like she gives him the same speech every time, tells him how difficult it is, even in this day and age, to be a woman and have a career, says that people continue to hold prejudices against her, that only recently have they started greeting her and not her assistant who's a man because they think he is the one who's head of the laboratory. It was her choice not to have a family, and socially she has to pay for it because people continue to think that women have to fulfill some biological plan, when her great accomplishment in life has been to press ahead, to never give in. Being a man is so much easier, she says. This is her family, the laboratory. But no one understands, not really. She's revolutionizing medicine, she tells him, and people continue to care whether her shoes are feminine or that her roots are showing because she didn't have time to go to the hairdresser or that she's gained weights. You know, Skip a bit into the next paragraph. He doesn't answer, Marcos doesn't, because he also knows that she has few female employees working for her. And if one of them were to get pregnant, she'd look down on her, disregard her. And meanwhile, over on the next page, they walk past a room with a specimen on a table. The specimen's chest has been cut open and his heart is beating. Like And he's still alive, by the way. He's sedated, so he won't faint from the pain. And excitedly, she adds, "What a beautiful beating heart! Isn't it incredible?" So yes, the most hideous person in the world, experiences sexism. Boo for her. Like,
The best jokes in the book is in this part.
yeah,
So it happens 3 times, which is, a perfect amount of times for it to happen. Of he's so done and he's so fed up that every time he's supposed to respond in the conversation, he doesn't. And she goes, "What was that?" And he goes, "I didn't say anything." And it happens 3 times, and that is funny. Like
because
you want someone to talk. What was that?
right,
Didn't say anything.
because in a sense, like, she's reproducing this misogynistic set of relations in her workplace. She's doing the most horrific things imaginable to men and women alike, in ways that literally got her compared to Nazis,
Yeah.
and yet she still has to be validated in this way, right? It's bourgeois feminism par excellence.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's also something where he's like, "I don't like to go here. I'm horrified. This is a sickening display." Once again, we have Marcos, the guy who will be signing the paper to send people to this laboratory, right? Like,
Hmm.
we cannot stress enough. She says here, "Send me strong ones because we're going to strap them to cars and send them like flying in the walls to like test new like seat belts," right? And he's like, "That's fucked up. I guess I gotta sign the paper. I'm so sad," right?
Oh, it's so fucking
Marcos,
horrifying. I love
yeah,
it.
it's awful. And Marcos is peak like guy on Twitter who is like, "I have to work for Lockheed Martin. Their health insurance is the best, or whatever, or like this, that, and the other." He's peak like guy in the system who has a great reason why it's just not his fault. He's just a small bean fascist. It's not on him. He's just like, he's just a little guy. It's not his fault. Oh my God.
Well,
Yeah.
it's like what we said in the last episode, right? When not what we said, what Paulo Freire said, right? When education isn't revolutionary, your ambition is to be the oppressor, right? And
I think I said that actually. That was my
yeah,
quote originally.
yeah,
But
actually,
Ferrera's thing is cool too.
did you go back in time or did Freire come forward in time?
It's kind of like
You met
yeah, it
in the
was a day, it
middle.
was a day of the tentacle type beat. This has been a
What the
Lucas Arts moment. Lucas Arts, make a game based on Tender is the Flesh.
Mm. Yeah, make a text adventure based on uh
Point and click, yeah. With
exactly.
flash
Exactly.
animations or
One of
preview.
the endings is where like you get to reunite with your estranged wife and also keep the fucking like cattle slave you have in your home
Mhm.
as like your
Those
mistress or
little
whatever.
animations. There's only two voice actors. There's a female voice actor and a male voice actor, and they're the only voices in the game, and they're doing different.
I say one of the endings is where you keep this cattle slave because spoiler alerts, he doesn't.
Mm.
Um she ultimately gives birth to his kid, and there's complications with the birth. It's at this point that Cecilia, his estranged wife, comes home to reunite with him, and he's like, "Okay, you're gonna have to get real cool with something real quick." And and he shows her the head that he's kept and impregnated, and now is going to have a son by.
And let me just, you know, read the end of this book here. Once she's taking care of these things, Cecilia hands back the baby, who's now calmed down. He looks at his son in disbelief. "He's beautiful," he says. "He's just beautiful." He feels the shards of stone shrink, lose their hold. Jasmine is in bed and she stretches out her arms. They ignore her, but she opens her mouth and moves her hands. She tries to get up, and then she does and bumps into the night table with her hips and knocks over the lamp. They look at her silently. "Go get some more towels and water to clean her before you take her out to the barn," Cecilia tells him. He gets up and gives his son to Cecilia, who begins to rock and sing to him. "He's ours now," he tells her, and she looks at him, unable to respond, emotional, confused. All Cecilia can do is look at the baby and cry silently. She cuddles him and says, "What a beautiful baby. You're the most adorable baby boy. What are we going to call you?" He goes to the kitchen and returns with something in his right hand. Jasmine is only able to stretch out her arms desperately towards her son. She tries to get up again, but is cut by the pieces of glass from the broken lamp. He sits down behind Jasmine. She looks back at him in despair. First, he puts his arms around her and kisses the mark on her forehead. He tries to calm her down. Then he gets onto his knees on the floor and says, "Easy does it. Everything's going to be just fine. Take it easy." With a wet rag, he wipes the sweat from her forehead. He sings "Summertime" into her ear. When she calms down a little, he stands up and grabs her by the hair. Jasmine is only able to move her hands, is trying to reach her son. She wants to speak, to scream, but there are no sounds. He picks up the club he brought from the kitchen and hits her on the forehead right where she's been branded. Jasmine falls to the floor, stunned, unconscious. Cecilia jumps when she hears the thud and looks at him without understanding. "Why?" she yells. "She could have given us more children." As he drags the body of the female to the barn to slaughter it, he says to Cecilia, his voice radiant, so pure it wounds, "She had the human look of a domesticated animal." And that's the end of the book.
Scene. Fucking scene.
Jesus Christ! Yeah. Fuck. Man.
I've been puzzling over that last line, because it's callous, it's hideous, it's in a
So pure
book.
it wounds, it says, which is an interesting line.
Literally, yeah, in a book of coldness, of detachment, of permanently. I mean, we talk about fascism as like the final destruction of the working class's ability to to organize and to act as a whole on its own behalf. Like it's I mean, this is that, with empathy thrown into the mix, right? The ability to view a whole other class of human as something to be bred and eaten and slaughtered, and to get like young off of, like it's that, it's that sense of, oh, I can look at this person as, who isn't a person anymore, as a domesticated animal, right? And not just that, but the human look of a domesticated animal. I can't read that and not think of, that meme of where, well, like the like pets and owners start to look similar after their own long enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you stare into this abyss that you have created by breeding this person for meat, and by keeping them in this primitive, languageless state, by literally cutting out their vocal cords so they can't scream, right? If you look into it enough, that abyss gazes back that you've created and you see yourself in it, and eventually, you have to make that choice, whether you rid yourself of the contradiction or you set it aside. I mean, and that's the thing. That's what I was alluding to earlier, is that the one thing that this society, the one thing that this paradigm couldn't do for Marcos was bring his son back.
Mm-hmm.
And now it can, you know? Like, yeah, you have this hole in your soul that can't that the transition and everything that came after it could not fill, and that's what really started exposing its brutality to you. But what if it could fill that hole, right? The contradiction has been resolved. Jasmine is back to having no name. It's again, Mark Fisher says, capitalist realism can only be threatened if it is shown to be in some way inconsistent or untenable. If that is to say, capitalism's ostensible realism turns out to be nothing of the sort, and that inconsistency is what he feels for his son, and now he has a new son.
Exactly. And on the human level, the level of character, Marcus Tejo is then shown to be evil, and his grief, his sympathy for the puppies, his annoyance at his shitty sister, his care for his father, his moments of tenderness, things where he's frustrated at his industry, his love of like mate tea and like whiskey, and his memory of his dead dogs, and in his love of his love of music is even exploited at the end here, because he uses it. It doesn't matter because he is what he is, and it doesn't lose its nature because it's sympathetic. In fact, I think this book is telling us there is very little evil that is not sympathetic when you examine it, and it doesn't matter because it's happening. And Marcos can say he's a product of the system, and that's true. And he is still also a conscious actor in the system, right?
He's
And those
been domesticated by it. That's the thing.
precisely.
He looks human, but he is not in any way
Yes.
that we recognize.
Exactly right. And I mean, I went on this rant last week where I talked about like whatever it was about JD Vance that was like remarkable and interesting and whatever. Like I did this whole rant. It is fucking dead now, right? And Marcos is the same way. He's a fictional version. He's an alternate universe version, but it's the same thing. And like these are people, and they are people that, yes, through the system, right? I'm not like moralizing and saying there are people who are born magically evil, but
Mm-mm.
because of the system and their decisions within it, influenced by the material conditions, but also the decisions they make, yeah, have destroyed that sense of humanity. They become creatures of the system. And of course, what's the solution to that is not to take out all the Marcoses and Erlets in the world. That won't do it, because the Marcoses of the world, maybe the Erlets, but the Marcoses of the world would not, in a normal, good society, behave in this way. I don't know about Erlet. I don't know what we would have to do with him in a normal society. Presumably, he would just be in like a community theater program and be like remotely, mostly harmless, if a bit annoying. But like the Marcos in a world that's not even like good, just like a world like that's not like this, could presumably work a normal job and be a normal guy, right? But because of the system, he is then empowered to, his worst instincts are then empowered, right? And that is why a system needs to be set up that, it doesn't make people good. Socialism does not make people good people automatically, but the things that are good, the collaborative aspects, right? The creativity, the empathy, the idea of building a better future, of solidarity, is actually encouraged by the mechanisms within the system, and they are encouraged to be what we would call good, even though, like, Marx would probably slap me on the wrist and say I'm moralizing, but you get what I'm saying. Those are encouraged by the system, and we live in a system now that does not encourage those traits. And obviously a system like this is a in this book is a supercharged darkness version of that. And I understand that this is like, evil to a fault almost, right? It's fucked up to a fault, but it is making a point, and it's not that far off when you consider the shit we see on our TVs and on our phones every day that we are like profiting on, and how many people we can meet and know who work for weapons contractors and elements of the government and the police and this, that, and the other, and people who are like not necessarily bad people who love their family, and they take care of each other, and they tip their waiters and they pet their dogs, and then they go and they, do whatever their little job is in the system, and it only takes a few people who are Erlets and who are the hammer swingers. You only need a handful of those, really, hyper reactionaries who like the blood, and the rest can just kind of follow along. And that's why the system has to be destroyed. And also, yeah, that's a broad point, but this book makes it so clear, right? It makes the dichotomy of personal choice, the false dichotomy of personal choice and systemic issue. Like, yeah, no, it is a systemic issue, and there are also people in the system that need to make different choices, and these things yeah, these things coalesce, right? It's not one or the other, it's both.
Jacob, that kind of talk is going to get you sent to the municipal slaughterhouse.
Thank God, honestly. um I'll have to do something to taste that. That'll be my revenge.
Well, and that's the thing, like it's the little revenges that people take within the system, like it's an acknowledgement that yes, I participate in it, but I don't want to be caught up in it, that I'm comfortable with my position there. Like we didn't mention this about Spinell, the early adopter, like small business tyrant, like Butcher Chick, who's just like very, very comfortable, cutting people up, right? Who was one of the first people to start selling like hands and eyeball liquor, and like bits and pieces, like the there was that period of like detachment from what's been done to our fellow man, but there was also that period of sort of reintroduction into polite conversation after the transition of what this means, right? The sort of what's the word I'm looking for? The trendification, I suppose, of like turning human body parts into accessories and delicacies, having like literal lady fingers, served as fucking like, aperitifs, like there is this active participation in normalization of glorification, in Arlette's case, of, cannibalizing one's fellow man. And yet you can do that as Spinel and also like smoke and drink and do everything you can to make your meat unfit for human consumption, bad tasting, bad texture, you can participate in this and then have your very last act, the thing that the choice that you make every day of your life be one final act of spite on your
Mhm.
fellow man,
Absolutely.
you know?
I do have an unfortunate fact for you. You're not gonna like this. Spinel is unfortunately the I could fix her character of the week. Neither here nor there.
You
You
know
know,
what? I'm sure somebody's written fan fiction about it. I'm sure somebody's written that, oh, let me just steady myself on a meat hook while I like get on top of you sort of fucking thing. Like on some level that's hot. Let's be honest.
there's things that are colliding with things here, and what can we say? Augustina, come on the pod, and answer. We'll get a translator and everything, and answer for what you have written here, and tell us what's hot, what's not, and ultimately what the revolution has to be to overthrow the human meat society. Well, folks, this has been Tinder is the Flesh, also known as Exquisite Corpse, also known as, what was it that I called it earlier?
Uh,
I had a good joke
what
earlier.
was it you called it earlier? The land where
Um,
people ate other people?
no, Jumpin' Jack Flesh. That's what I
Oh,
called
that's
it earlier.
right. Yes.
That was good. Um, but I already kind of said my final like rant about this book. So like, Lenore, do you have any final thoughts? I mean, I might walk away from this saying this was good, and also it made its points, and I feel like through talking about it, I've like synthesized some of the points that I didn't quite get when I originally whatever, and like kind of the trick that she's pulling off here.
Hmm.
And there's definitely more to like get into if like we wanted to, like why is there an act one and act two? Why is it like there's certain some things like that that we don't
Well,
have full time to get into.
I can make a stab at it, right?
Sure.
Because it's the point where it's the point before and after he crosses this line, right? It's the point before and after he engages in this taboo, It's the point it's the point I think where you could really draw a line through the book and be like, okay, he could either rediscover some common humanity in this person who's been degraded and try and build off of that, or he could just find a way to, recompartmentalize, right? To
Mhm.
to rebuild that delineation between special meat and what counts as human.
Mhm.
Like it's
That's true. That's a good point.
yeah.
I think I think the main takeaway we have to have from this book is that we should all give a special shout out to me for not once grandstanding as a vegan while talking about this.
Literally, like there's a bit early on
That's
where
right.
yeah, somebody jokes that like, oh, it's the revenge of the vegans,
Uh,
like I think his sister at one point is like, oh, you're not becoming one of those weird veganoids, are you?
Veganoids, vegan cells, the cringe vegan cells versus the base Tinder fleshoids. I don't know what I'm talking about. What the
The
Sigma,
Virgin
bro.
Marcos versus the Chad Erlet.
Erlet, I could not fix. He would ruin me.
Hmm.
I'm just gonna say it right now. I'm gonna
Oh
say it
yeah.
right now. And yet, well, we'll leave that up to interpretation. But
It's I mean, my final thought here, it's a book about realizing where you are in a hierarchy, right? Realizing where you are in an inherently exploitative system, whether, you're bourgeois or you're part of the labor aristocracy, right? Where you're part of a group of people that's exploited perhaps, but not super exploited, whose standard of living still depends on, somebody else being meat, right? In some form or fashion, it's a book about realizing, putting on the fucking they live glasses, right? And seeing through the obfuscation, seeing through the language that's constructed to make people okay with this, and then making a decision based on that, right? because the decision is yours. You can be that one guy from Act 1 who tries to free all the head, who does something adventurous and then ultimately gets fired and goes home and shoots himself. You can find other people to organize with. You can do something constructive about it. You can do any number of things when you recognize where you are in this world. And this is the sort of book that shows you, well, you could just as easily, keep going to work every day and pushing the child threshing button, and the child threshing machine, and then go home at the end of the day and just, put on the, beating cats to death with sticks for the promise of a car game show. That's the real, it's the real horror of it, is that you could continue doing exactly what you're doing.
My final thoughts is, how did in the Rolling Stone section we not reference the song Anybody Seen My Baby? Thanks, folks.
Good night.
Thank you for listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.